My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image, and I welcome you to tonight's talk, led by David Schwartz in honor of his new book, which is being published right this week, I believe, David Cronenberg Interviews, published by University Press of Mississippi. David Schwartz is a long time association with Museum of the Moving Image. In fact, goes back to the very, very early days of Museum of the Moving Image, and then became the chief curator of the museum and was my mentor. The reason that the reason I'm involved in the museum at all, for better and for worse. Better for me, I'm not sure about for everybody else, but I'm grateful to him and grateful to all the things that he has meant to the museum and to New York cinema. And at the moment, he is now a programmer of the Paris Theater for Netflix. I'm very curious to know in the coming weeks and months to see what he has in store for us at the Paris, now that we might be able to go back into movie theaters in New York. But in the interim, during this year, when many of us wasn't quite sure what to do with ourselves, David knew exactly what to do with himself. He edited a volume of interviews of David Cronenberg. And I know that David has a long time interest in the works of David Cronenberg. He programmed a lot of different series over the years at the museum. And I think he'll probably give us a little bit of context about where the book came from. And I know he also has some great guests for tonight of folks who contributed to that book. And so let's start by bringing on the great David Schwartz. David, you want to join us?
Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Hey. Hi, Eric. Thanks for the great introduction. And it is, I'd say it's definitely better for the film world that you're at the Museum of the Moving Image doing an amazing job. So thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to hold up a copy of the book. Here it is. This is the official publication date for this book. It's also David Cronenberg's birthday. And so it's fitting. He's 78 today. This photograph is by his daughter, Caitlin, who's a really accomplished photographer on her own. He has a son, Brandon Cronenberg, who's becoming quite an accomplished filmmaker. David Cronenberg was one of the first major retrospectives I did at the museum back in 1992. But I want to bring on what I'll say very quickly about this book is it's a collection of interviews, some of which I've done, but I have a great lineup of writers who have interviewed and written about Cronenberg over the years, and it's a really illustrious panel of some of the top critics and thinkers about film around. So I want to bring them on, I guess, one by one, starting with.
Hold on, David. I'm just going to let everybody know that I'm going to leave
okay.
visually so that there are not too many faces on here, and there are better faces coming on. So I'm going to disappear, but you go ahead and introduce everybody. Sorry.
Okay. See you later. Thanks, Eric. So I want to first bring on Amy Taubin, who wrote for many years for the Village Voice. She's one of the finest film critics in the world. She had a long stint at the Village Voice, but also has written for Film Comment, for Sight and Sound, for Art Forum. She's written a lot about David Cronenberg and always written brilliantly about him. Her interviews in the book are about Cosmopolis and Dangerous Methods. So hi, Amy.
Hi there.
And hi, Kat, behind you.
Yes.
I next want to bring on Carrie Rickey, who was in New York for a long time. Her career started in New York, but she moved down to Philadelphia and had a 25-year run at the Philadelphia Inquirer as film critic and writer about film. Her interview with David Cronenberg about M. Butterfly, is one of his lesser talked about movies, is in the book, but she's written a lot of other pieces about Cronenberg. And I'll mention that her bio says she's interviewed everybody from Lillian Gish to Will Smith. So next want to bring on William Beard, who is with the film department at the University of Alberta. Bill has his website says everybody calls him Bill, so I'm taking the liberty. Wrote the first, with Piers Handling, co-wrote and edited the first important book about Cronenberg called The Shape of Rage, and also wrote a wonderful monograph on his own called The Artist as Monster. Has also written books about Guy Madden and Clint Eastwood. So thanks for being with us today. That's the last we'll hear about Clint Eastwood in this discussion, probably. This particular discussion, nothing against him. Next, want to bring on Graham Fuller, who had a very long run with Interview magazine, the magazine that was started by Warhol. Graham was both a film columnist and editor there, and has written books about Dennis Potter and Ken Loach. In the Cronenberg interview book, he writes about Maps to the Stars, which was sadly it's been a number of years since that came out, and it's the latest film we have from Cronenberg. We're all looking forward to the next one. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Graham. Okay, next I want to bring on Gavin Smith, who had an amazing tenure and run at what was then called Film Society at Lincoln Center, now Film at Lincoln Center. Gavin was a great programmer for Film Society, and also a fantastic editor of Film Comment magazine. He really did an amazing job there, bringing Film Comment up to date while honoring the history of the magazine. He after leaving Film Comment, was programming and working at the Quad Cinema, doing repertory programming. So Gavin, thanks so much for being here. And our last panelist is Nick Rapold, who, and I just want to mention Gavin did a great interview about the movie Crash. That's in the book, that was originally for Film Comment. Nick was actually Gavin's successor as editor at Film Comment magazine, and also had an incredible run with that magazine, and beloved Film Comment, I should say, and now has his own Substack, The Last Thing I Saw, which has actually a great podcast and also terrific writing. So I recommend subscribing to that. So thanks everybody. This is quite a stellar lineup. And Cronenberg is the director, I think, who there are directors. There are directors. I always thought of Cronenberg as like a critics director, a director who really intelligent film critics seem to love to write about. So thanks to all of you for all your writing about David Cronenberg. I actually wanted to start with a question for Amy, because when we think about Cronenberg's early career, we usually think first of the horror movies, but I usually think of his connection in his formative years to the New York avant-garde, and it's something I sort of feel like there's a connection that Amy has. And so I want to know maybe if I could throw that topic out to you.
Yeah.
I think Cronenberg was it's a really important influence, and it takes us through his entire career, like that influence. Cronenberg actually started a filmmakers co-op in Toronto with some other people that was modeled on the New York Filmmakers Co-op.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I met David, although I can't remember him at all, was in 1967 when Michael Snow invited him. He was in New York, and he invited him to come to dinner at Luchow, which was then on 14th Street. Wow. And I was there, and I think Jonas was there, Jonas Mekas, and I forget who else. He was, as I can remember, a really smart kid. He and Michael used to live right next door to each other in Toronto, although their work is so totally apart. Yeah. But they had, I think, a cordial relationship. And then I didn't see him again till, I don't know, Dead Ringers.
Okay, that's quite a gap in between.
And I wasn't very interested in the early short films, which seemed smart, but overly controlled, let's put it that way.
No, just to be clear, when you talk about the early short films, you're talking about
Stereo.
Okay, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, like the sort of avant-garde features that he did before his first horror movies. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So Bill Beard, I wanted to ask you about your early interest in Cronenberg, because actually you can tell us the first time you met him, but I read that the first time your first important encounter with Cronenberg was coming out of a screening of Shivers, or The Kingdom Within. Can you tell that? I'll let you tell that.
Yeah, I was met I was met by a reporter from the Edmonton Journal, the local newspaper, who said, exactly how appalled are you that this movie was made with government money? And I had to explain that actually I really liked it, and that was met with a degree of surprise. Yeah, I got interested in court. I was basically a radio movie reviewer for a long time, and I was struck by these little films. I mean, nobody had heard of David Cronenberg where I came from, and probably anywhere else at the time that Shivers came out. And it rose to notoriety because the Saturday Night, which was a prestigious journal in Canada, had this article by Robert Fulford, an important Canadian critical personage, saying, you should be completely appalled that this movie was made with public money. And to me, this was, well, obviously to miss the boat completely on this movie. So, and as these earlier films came out, as Shivers and Rabid and The Brood came out, I got more and more interested in Cronenberg stuff. Managed to track down Stereo and Crimes of the Future. In fact, I had to go to Toronto to actually look at those. And so I wrote this rather long essay on Cronenberg cinema up to, well, at that point, Videodrome. The first time I met him, I believe, was 1979, when he was already thinking about Videodrome, and I met him in his house, and he was distracted and talked about himself as being in the middle of a sort of waking nightmare that was the state of actually imagining Videodrome as it was going on. So I interviewed him then, and then I came back and interviewed him in 1983 along with Piers Handling for the publication of The Shape of Rage. And at that point, I managed to get, I saw him in the editing room working on The Dead Zone. And I got a strip of outtake from Videodrome, which is now a prized possession. Yeah. So he was, I mean, I looked up to him tremendously. I had really no status, so to speak. And of course, as everybody here knows, he's incredibly articulate. He's incredibly thoughtful. He is ahead of you, so to speak, all the time in interviews. But sadly, that's the last time I actually interviewed Cronenberg. Although I spent the rest of my scholarly career writing about him.
I do want to, stop and we did suggest that people watch The Brood before this discussion. There's any number of films we could have done. I like that it was available for free for people who could watch it on YouTube, and it seems like a key film. Certainly, the title of your book, The Shape of Rage, is partly an homage to The Brood. We see that. Yeah. So let's just talk about that movie and where it fits in. And I'll just throw it open to all of you, for maybe your comments about like what, where does it fit into Cronenberg's career? What is the importance of it?
Well, it might be his most personal film. Mm-hmm. It was inspired by his divorce. And I remember I interviewed him for the first time about a year after The Brood came out. And I think he said something like, it's my Kramer versus Kramer, yeah, but more realistic.
Right. It came out a little bit before.
It both came out in 79.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It did precede it.
Yeah.
I think his feeling about Kramer versus Kramer was that it was essentially dishonest and sugar-coated, and it was his belief, he wanted to come from a more visceral place and do something which to him was realistic, was authentic on the subject of divorce.
Right. I mean, he's talked about it as being autobiographical, but when you meet him, I mean, some of you suggested this already, but he's the most sort of controlled, articulate, sort of pleasant person. But it's so important for him to be in touch with this aspect of rage. I mean, this balance, this is what his sort of the central tension in his whole career is, this balance between these sort of, you know, dark forces within that can't be controlled. You know,
to me, I think The Brood, I mean, you had Shivers, which was about an explosion of sex-crazed maniacs in an apartment building, who at the end drive out of the apartment building to invade Toronto. Or is it Montreal? I can't remember.
No, it's
Shivers is Montreal.
It's shot on the island.
Shivers is Montreal.
Is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, oh, that's right, Carrie. Yeah, and then Rabid, which had you know, soldiers shooting down people in the streets because there was a plague of rabid citizens running around infecting everybody else. And The Brood is this chamber piece by comparison.
Yeah.
And it takes place inside a family largely. And it has a kind of sadness to it, a kind of, I think of it as a very Canadian movie, actually. It's a movie about failure. And as Pierce Handley pointed out in an essay in The Shape of Rage, it stages again the Canadian hero of Canadian films that none of you will have seen probably. The passive kind of nice guy, ineffective hero, who's definitely you know, that describes the hero of The Brood. So and there are no guts in this film, to put it that way.
Well, there is a lot of
It has
there's
its
some lot of blood.
Reproductive ooze.
The last scene is, you're absolutely right. The last scene is full-blown Cronenberg body horror. But until then, what we have is these little creatures in sort of blue raincoats running around, hitting people with you know, glass bibelots and you know, little
Weren't they
kitchen
called
hammers
killer
and stuff like
dwarves?
kitchen hammer. Yeah.
The
first
first
one-
time, sorry,
Go ahead, Amy.
the first time I saw The Brood was when it came out. And I guess unfortunately for The Brood, it came out at a particularly heated moment of feminism in film. And I had complicated reactions to it. I still do. When I said before that I thought that Cronenberg had a slow learning curve, it's his first partnership with Howard Shore. So it is the first movie that felt to me emotionally expressive, and that's the Howard Shore part. But he hadn't yet hooked up with Peter. So the cinematography is still very flat, and it is the color of depression. That film is just this beige and brown thing that takes place at the end of winter when nothing is even budding yet. I didn't find it sad. I found it agonizing. And I was also extremely angry at it. And when I then met David later, I never gave up the argument that I had about The Brood and just about every other film except maybe A Dangerous Method, which is that, and rightfully so, he is interested in patriarchy. And he is interested in setting up this narrative where there are men who are trying to be alpha men and men who are submissive to the alpha men. And then there are women in the middle who are trapped and get very angry about the situation. And it's repeated in film after film. But The Brood is the first place that it's articulated in that form.
I agree with Amy's schematic here. However, I always thought, especially in The Brood, and in A Dangerous Method and in Rabid, that these were all movies where men are trying to control the woman, but the more the woman is pushed, the more she is unyielding. And I thought there was, it was also, it might have been about the patriarchy, but it was also about how to stall the patriarchy or to not move. And because as hard as the husband, I guess, is victorious in The Brood.
Yes, and she's not.
True. She lives on in that movie. The fade out. She lives on. Her DNA is alive. So I don't know. I viewed it. I had many arguments with Robin Wood about this movie, and he totally agreed with me.
Right. Me? Yeah, Robin Wood comes up a lot in the discussions in this book. It's an ongoing feud, and it seems to be part of what Cronenberg is doing is really trying to disturb people. I mean, trying to not fit into an ideological, I guess to him, like straitjacket. I mean, so he took great pleasure in irritating Robin Wood, it seems like.
Well, I have to say, I'm not in the Robin Wood camp. I've never been in the Robin Wood camp.
Right.
I'd just like to address Amy's point about Cronenberg being a patriarchal filmmaker. I think he said, that his attitudes, I mean, he's also obviously flirted with bisexuality in his films, but I think his attitude to women, and he's the first to admit it, comes from the fact that he said that, it's basically because I'm a heterosexual male, and it's inevitable that these are my fantasies, and I'm not going to censor myself as an artist. It doesn't make it good. I don't know if it necessarily makes it bad, but I feel that he's being truthful to himself. So
well, I absolutely agree with that, but I knew what I was seeing on the screen, which is that story, and which is repeated in most of the films, and I'm very sympathetic to it. I mean, I'm not arguing with it, but it's quite stunning in The Brood. Before that, you don't quite know what's going on. And in The Brood, it's absolutely there and in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I don't think The Brood is that characteristic in some ways, because I guess I look at things differently here. I think that for Cronenberg, the woman is above all the center of desire, center of sexual desire, and that sexual desire is chaotic. It is very powerful, and it upsets everything, including the man. Very much including the man. It's definitely from his standpoint. Whereas in The Brood, I don't think there really is sexual attraction very much. But I think if one looks at a lot of the later films, that's I mean, Videodrome, I think, is a very good case in point of the way that sexuality, in particular kind of transgressive sexuality that involves sadism, is a huge turning point and a turn on. I don't look at this as politically exactly within that kind of context of the patriarchy. But there have been scholars, women scholars, who have pointed out this. I mean, Barbara Creed wrote a book called The Monstrous Feminine, which is simply about this, about the fact that women are monsters in a lot of Cronenberg's films, and that they are monsters by virtue of their sexual attraction for men who are destabilized by these things. And it's not women's fault.
Thank you very much.
It's the men's fault to be destabilized in this fashion. It's to be overwhelmed and not to be able to see things in any kind of, just to be destabilized.
Well, I'd like to respond to that. I think that I mean, there are certain exceptions like A History of Violence and I guess Videodrome, but I generally think that Cronenberg's approach to sexuality is very clinical. And I don't think that his movies are generally, I don't think the women in his movies are overly sexualized. I think that, as I say, there are exceptions, but I mean, a film like Naked Lunch, or even a film like Crash, where there is a kind of obvious sexual component, it's not something that he treats in a hot way. I think he's very clinical about it.
I think that I think we should not have such a long discussion about this, but I think that the women characters find a way to make do in the film with the world that they're given. And, you know, I identify with a lot of them. I don't think it's an issue of desire. I think he's not interested in their problem. He's interested in the problem of masculinity.
Yes.
And
yes,
that's
absolutely.
what the films are about.
Absolutely.
So you have to say, well, I'm interested in the problem of masculinity too. In 1979, feminists weren't.
Right.
It's different today.
Right. I mean, it's a little bit like you could of course say the same thing about Kubrick, who's like clearly like, you know, not interested, doesn't seem to be interested in women at all. You know, in Cronenberg, at least there are women who have strong sexual appetites or desire. I mean, there's a stronger feminine force in his films. You know, and I think actually it was kind of striking to me how Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance, I think, in Existence. I mean, that's a character I think who's probably the most strongest sexual character, maybe in any of his films.
Well, there's also the I suppose the pub tart in Spider, the second Miranda Richardson character. That's very interesting to me because that, I think, if you take that character too literally, you run into trouble, because very clearly it's a projection of the boy, and it's a kind of an exaggerated Oedipal fantasy that the boy, although he's a little young actually to have that kind of Oedipal fantasy, but it's
for yourself, Graham.
Well, it's a proper Freudian, he's not to you.
Well, it's you know, potentially she is an Oedipal projection, and she's a fairly voracious female character. There's one other thing I'd like to say about The Brood, though. What made it exciting for me, looking at it again last few days, is that the brood, the children, especially the first manifestation of the monstrous children in the red coat, which I think possibly shows the influence of Nicolas Rapold and Don't Look Now, which Cronenberg has said independently that he was very affected by that film. But I think The Brood is really exciting because of the way the children the monstrous children are the unconscious outpourings of the mother's rage, and in that you can look forward to Spider, certainly, possibly to Naked Lunch as a kind of expression of the unconscious. And for me, Cronenberg, it's really exciting when the madness or the excess is very clearly mental and not necessarily expressed through body horror.
Yeah, if I could just add something about the children. I mean, this is not the most profound thing, but just not to take for granted the elegance of the visual imagination there of the snowsuits, which is just such an effective device for making them even more disturbing, and then their faces being this kind of trash humpers style masks that they're wearing, and also the way he's shooting them, always cutting off from above the head. So just on the level of the text, I just think with every single movie, he's finding a very effective and kind of novel way of, and the audio of their whatever their incoherent, screams and shouts is very violent. I feel like you can hear it like scratching your ears when you hear them shout and scrabble about. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the pint-sized horror of those pseudo children.
I think they're like the birds in The Birds.
Yes.
I kept seeing the birds this time around when I watched the movie.
Yeah, yeah. And their scenes are so horrific too. I mean, I don't know how many people would shoot the murder of the teacher and have it take place in front of the kindergartners. I think most people would somehow in the screenplay would manage to make it such that it's after school and the kids have left or something, but it all happened. Right. And I find that scene actually almost hard to watch because you can hear the kids whimpering and then afterwards they're cowering. I mean, I know it's, it's horror, but that one almost, it just disturbs me in a very.
It seems to me that's like part of what is so essential about Cronenberg. This idea that you have to see it, you have to experience it, that he's not a director about having things happen off screen or leaving them to the imagination. It's all about these ideas like being visualized and coming to life. And that idea seems like really critical to him, like to really show you. Although, I do agree with Bill, what you were saying before, The Brood is like surprisingly restrained. It delivers the shocks, it delivers the blood, but there's a lot of quiet and restrained moments,
There's another feature of this film that we haven't talked about, and that is the presence of the Oliver Reed character, the scientist in this film. And this is very much a restaging of this personage who goes all the way back to Stereo and Crimes of the Future, of the experimenting scientist. And then you have it in Shivers, where this guy, first thing you see him doing is committing suicide, but he is trying to liberate mankind by implanting them with sex parasites because they're too repressed. And then in Rabid, what happens to Marilyn Chambers is that she is, what happens to her is the result of a radical scientific experiment. And then we have Oliver Reed, who's terrific in this film. I think the opening scene is just staggering.
Yeah.
Is that he's talking about the young man Michael and really
yes, that's Michael. Right. And why don't you just why don't you get into your frilly dresses and your this complete humiliation from a gender standpoint of the boy. And the idea here is to get everything expressed somatically, right? You have something, you have a neurosis, you have a terrible pain inside, and the idea is to get it outside, to take it out of your mind and put it onto your body, and therefore somehow to be able to deal with it in that fashion, or it doesn't work. And these scientific experiments finally never do work in the way that they're intended to.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that in those early movies, and maybe even stretching to A Dangerous Method, a lot of them are about these men who think they're going to bring happiness or deliverance or better lives to the world, and there's all these unintended consequences. It's always like, I view all these characters like Robert Oppenheimer. I'm going to build a bomb and it's going to solve the war, but it has unintended consequences. And it's about the vanity of these male scientists who think they can help, but they really hurt. And that's
also about. Sorry, please. Sorry, Carrie.
Go on.
No, I mean I'm barging in here a bit, but the transformation, the project of transformation in Cronenberg is a big one that goes through all of his films, I think up to right up to History of Violence, and the idea that you're going to be transformed into something different, something better. You're going to be liberated from your neurosis in some way, and this project of liberation again almost never works, and you run into this series of films beginning with I guess with Videodrome, which is a suicide followed by a suicide followed by a suicide followed by a suicide, and there's this really I think a kind of desperate I use the word melancholy, but a sense of I don't know, a failure and of complete loss of faith in this, even though Cronenberg in his interviews is constantly talking about how this process is a good one and how we should all try to transform ourselves in this way.
I just have to disagree about A History of Violence, which is totally about a guy who thinks he can totally transform himself, get rid of the place he came from, take a new name because it's available, which had to be the funniest line ever.
Okay, I'll take it back. You're right.
Where did the name come? It was available. And finds he can't, and then is there and has to wash himself in the waters before he can go home to get rid of this final instance of dealing with his family. So it's a film that's totally about transformation.
I want to talk about the shape of Cronenberg's career, and it makes a lot of sense. Like we to dwell on the horror films, these early films that sort of established his reputation, established a lot of his themes, but he really makes a shift towards literary adaptation. Every Cronenberg film feels like his movie, but he's basically done adaptations since The Dead Zone.
Well, yeah, I could comment on that.
Go ahead.
I remember reading an interview with Cronenberg back around the time of Scanners, which he wrote, and he was mocking Kubrick for not being able to come up with a screenplay of his own, and he always had to wait for the right novel to come along, and he was very dismissive of Kubrick in that way, and yet eventually he acknowledges that that there's a limit to how many screenplays he can come up with, and he does. And Naked Lunch was definitely a dream project that he wanted to do. He talks about that very early on in his career as something he'd like to do. But I think the real shift is, it's to generalize again, but it's probably even obvious, is that there's after he gets to about the point of The Fly, the films following on from that, maybe with the exception of Existence, are much more on the terrain of psychology and don't really have as much to do with body horror. It's body horror up until The Fly, and then after that, maybe Dead Riggers is sort of a transitional film. They're really films of the mind rather than of the body.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
What I would argue with Cronenberg, it's never either or. It's how
Right.
It's always, there is no mind body split in his movies. It's always both of them operating at the same time, and that's what makes them really exciting and engaging for me. And unlike anyone else's movies, mind and body expanding at the same time, and I think that's a through line.
Well, he talks about, again, in the early interviews, I grew up watching his films. I saw The Brood when I was 15, but in the early interviews, he talks a lot about the mind-body problem. But I sort of disagree with you. I think the body becomes less of an issue after The Fly. Then maybe, I may be overlooking a film here or there, but broadly, I feel like he's going much more into the interior. And a film like Spider is taking the interiority of a character and bringing it forth.
I think that Cronenberg always had ambition to be an artist and to be thought of as an artist. And all of his interviews, all of his statements are those of an articulate, self-conscious, artistic sensibility. But he was mired in cheap horror movies from the beginning, and even all the way through to The Fly, which was still his biggest success. This was the thing that he was identified with. I think that as he got more and more success, he moved over into a more sort of naturally, quote unquote, artistic kind of mode of filmmaking, and that he's getting interviewed by Serge Grunberg and Cahiers du Cinema, and he's being accepted as an artist in this way. Naked Lunch, I think, is a very strong kind of statement of this, and so he's drifting off into a more cerebral, a more arty kind of approach to cinema, and also to the kinds of subjects that he's using, and so the body is always an intrusion on that.
But and even in his horror films, I think he likes the idea, or is interested in the idea, that what's really scary comes from within us. Rather, he said in one interview, like Jaws, like the fish in Jaws is scary, but it's really scary to him is what comes from within. And the horror films, these inner forces manifest themselves in disgusting ways. But I think that's in all of his films, this idea of like this journey inside the mind. And I think the later films get more and more, well, what I love about Videodrome is that a big chunk of the film takes place entirely within the main character's mind. And the films get more and more involved in taking us inside dream worlds and inside the mind. The other thing I just wanted to say was that about authors and about the theme of transformation. I think he became very interested in the idea of working with an author, adapting a book, and seeing what comes out of that tension between his own ideas and the author, between J.G. Ballard or whoever it is, Don DeLillo. That's something new that's going to come out of this union or fusion.
It's ironic that the BFI book on Crash by Ian Sinclair calls Cronenberg the asset stripper of the modernist literary canon.
Right.
Very, very. He wants Cronenberg to go back to making shivers instead of this polished,
his earlier, funnier movies. I'm curious what I want to make sure we touch on some of the later works. I feel like I'm just curious where you guys think certain recent films stand. I mean, you wrote very beautifully about Cosmopolis. That's a film we both love. I think was, most people don't like that movie. Maps to the Stars, I think, actually, I want to touch on Maps to the Stars, because I think it actually is terrific and relates to the earlier films in a lot of ways. But let's talk about some of these works. Like, what are some of your favorite, maybe underrated or underappreciated Cronenberg films?
I think Spider is his masterpiece, personally. I know Amy's written some beautiful stuff about it. And there, I think because it is such an occupation of the mind, that and he's able to create such extraordinary visuals from imaginings, somebody else's imaginings, that is, which are his own imaginings. That to me is Cronenberg at his most expressive. The imagery in that film, the extraordinary austerity of the sets, which are yet so expressive. It's an England that I just about remember growing up.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And Gavin and I grew up in what was still post-war England, and it was bleak in many places, and I recognized that world. And I think, to me, Spider is really the ultimate Cronenberg film.
Yeah, it's tricky though, this thing about his depiction of England in Spider, because I mean, it's taking place in two periods. There's the remembered past, which I can just about connect to, and for a while I was trying to puzzle out when is this set in the present, and I sort of conclude that it's in the 80s or 90s, because based on the stroller that the woman has coming out of the house, the clothes some of the people are wearing in various scenes, but for a long time I really couldn't place it. I mean, for instance, that gasometer, they don't really, those things don't work anymore in London. They're there, but they're not used. They're just empty.
Well, the boy has what I think is a Fair Isle sweater on. I may be wrong about that, but it's a particular kind of sweater that boys in England wore during World War II and then into the 50s. So if you assume that he's, what, 30, 40 years on from that, that would place it maybe in the 90s, something like that.
And it's definitely post-war England, the allotments, the sort of the tin roof.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I
think he really did an extraordinary job with that. And I agree with you, Graham. I think Spider, it's a tie between Spider and A Dangerous Method for me.
It's a tie for me between Spider, A History of Violence, and A Dangerous Method.
Oh, okay.
Dead Ringers.
Dead Ringers?
Dead Ringers all day and all night for me.
Although I love Spider, then, huh?
Exactly for all the reasons you're talking about.
For me, it would be photo finish between The Fly, Dead Ringers, A Dangerous Method, but also he made a whole cluster of prophetic movies like Videodrome and Shivers and Existenz, which are interesting in their prophecy, in the prophetic aspects. So I mean, favorite is something that changes with me every day. It's hard for me to pick just one.
Yeah, same for me. I don't know how it would settle on just one, but it's some mix, some unholy mix of Videodrome, Crash, and History of Violence. But I mean, what struck me as I was trying to puzzle out my answer for that is that I think, each movie, I was just reading one of the interviews, he says the movie tells you what it needs. And I find that's what he does. So each individual movie feels like, in many ways, the best version of that story that it would be, the most vivid and lurid and disturbing, it could be at that moment. So yeah. There are not a lot of Crash fans here, or?
Sure.
Right, but
I think, what I was gonna, when you sent out that question saying what do you think the most underrated Cronenberg film is, the first film that came to my mind was The Dead Zone, because nobody rates it very highly, generally speaking, and I think it's a much more tight and expressed and interesting film than I think most people do.
Yeah, it might just not be considered.
Sorry.
Oh, no. I just think I guess the reputation of that is that it was a commercial success, and it was sort of a Stephen King adaptation, and not as much his film as the one that came right before it, which is Videodrome, which is totally his creation.
If Dead Zone and The Fly are his most commercial ones, those do happen to be my least favorite of his films.
Oh, really?
For some reason. I mean, I'm not saying they're not good, but they're not top tier Cronenberg for me. And because I grew up watching these films, that first burst from Shivers to Videodrome has a special place in my heart. I mean, that's really,
I'm with you there.
Those films all matter to me.
Yeah, agree. I mean, Videodrome just felt like a full all-out masterpiece, at the time, and it was, right at that moment, right at the introduction of home video. So, it's hard to sort of remember exactly where that fell. Like, it was one of the first movies that, you would watch. Most people probably saw that on video cassette.
And there's a television version that was broadcast, which has scenes in it that are nowhere at all in the released print.
Really?
That reveal that Videodrome was just originally started out as a weapon for the U.S. Army, and a bunch of things that are just not in. I haven't been able to. I saw this, but I haven't been able to find a copy of it.
That material is probably on the Criterion DVD because it's got a lot of extras, cut scenes and stuff. But yeah, I read that too.
Yeah, let's just. I know we're running a bit low on time, but let's just hit on A Dangerous Method. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that film was not. I guess it was not incredibly well received, and there was a lot of attention to, a lot of sort of focus on Keira Knightley's performance. I think it was sort of underappreciated. And I think what's great about that film, and I think it's true of some of the later films, is Cronenberg's like masterful use of, just editing and the language of constructing the scene is so expressive, but it's a bit subtle what he's doing. But I don't know, Amy, maybe some of you could talk about what you love about that. You're on mute right now, Amy.
Still can't hear you.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry. God, A Dangerous Method. There's Spielrein, who is a great character that is now someone who people know. This brilliant woman who was never allowed, probably as brilliant as either Freud or Jung, but she was a woman, and then she married, and then she went to the Soviet Union where she became a doctor, and then she got shot by the Nazis. Back there, I have the collected writings of Sabina Spielrein, and she is really great. But what interested me so much in this film, besides the Freud-Jung father-son thing, conflict, was that Cronenberg's films have this underlying core of Jewishness, not of religion, but of culture. And of course, there is The Last Jew in the last projection.
Best cinema in the world.
Cinema in the world. The suicide of him, which he showed in Cannes, and knowing full well how sensitive the French are about this whole issue. And when it showed, people were just like sitting there like, well, we can't make a sound, and what is this, and how fast can I get out of here without having to say anything? But here, that great scene where Freud tells Spielrein that you should never forget that we are Jews. And that for Freud, Jung was the person who he thought would be his beard, his cover, so that psychoanalysis would not be the Jewish science. And I always remember in one of the early films, and one of the things I had like, it's either Rabid or, I forget if it's Rabid or the other one, where there are a group of guys and they're sitting around a table and they're unwrapping corned beef sandwiches. And Jim Overman and I turned to each other and said, when have we ever seen people in a film eating corned beef sandwiches and pickles? And that was there. And then lo and behold, that is what A Dangerous Method is so much about. About psychoanalysis as the Jewish science that Freud was afraid would be dismissed for that reason. And also about the fact that Jung sat out the Second World War in front of his lake in Geneva and never said a word or did anything. That's there. But I got into a big argument about that. Said, he's Swiss.
I think Spielrein is in a way that the structuring absence in a way of why Dangerous Method exists. I think of Dangerous Method as a comedy that is actually a tragedy because of what happened to her, and she is the pivotal figure, not Freud and not Jung. She, if you will, is the person who breathes it into existence and showcases in a way the rivalry between the two men and the Oedipal rivalry as well. And I thought Keira Knightley was more than adequate in that role, and in a way it's quite a haunting performance because she's so troubled. And and that, you know, the violence that she's complicit in is complicating, of course. But I think it's a film that needs to be looked at as pretty dark, actually.
It's very dark. And it's also a return to somatizing, because her hysteria is the non-phantasmagorical form of the early films, because at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, women were hysterics, and that's what they did. And so, yeah.
Well, Graham, when you say that A Dangerous Method is pretty dark, which is the Cronenberg film that's kind of lighthearted?
Scanners, it's the only one.
Wow, that's rough.
That's a pretty good. That's pretty. Oh, yeah, pretty true. But I do
think some of his films are intended to be comedies. I think Crash is hysterically funny.
I think there's funny moments in The Fly.
Yeah, that's right. And Amy and I both remember the screening of A History of Violence in Cannes, where most of the press contingent, or at least the North American press contingent, were laughing a lot, and an Austrian friend of ours was extremely upset about that, and I eventually yelled out, "Stop laughing." I mean, I don't think the film's a laugh riot, but I think it's obviously one of the kind of more playful films he's made.
Yeah,
and I think there's a dry humor. I mean, if Cronenberg in person is very witty. He's not super dry. He's pretty overtly funny. He's a bit of a
he's much funnier than his films. Yeah,
he's a bit of a stand-up comedian, but there's a dry sense of humor, I think, in just about all the movies. Like Cosmopolis played to me as a very dry comedy.
Well, it's a satire.
Yeah. So I think there's no His films are not lighthearted, but they're also more emotional. I mean, I do love Crash, and Crash, there was a really beautiful new Blu-ray edition of it that Criterion put out. And so I just watched it again recently. I hadn't seen it in a long time, and was struck by, what felt to be like sort of sheer provocation at the time, and felt like a bit colder when I first saw it. It seemed like actually quite emotional. On seeing it again. I mean, as outrageous as it is in a way, and as like sort of designed as it is to be subversive and to be provocative, and it's a quite touching film.
One thing we haven't talked about is what a good director of actors and actresses he is.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
I think a lot of Oliver Reed's performance in The Brood.
Jeremy Irons.
Well, Jeremy Irons in each scene twice, and sometimes playing the other brother, and it's all in the body language. It's just a spectacular performance. I mean, Keira Knightley in A Dangerous Method. Maria Bello in The History of Violence.
Mm-hmm.
My God, what a great director of actors he is, and how I don't know how he gets his performances out of
Ray Fiennes and Spider.
Oh, amazing. I mean, he's worked with really a lot of great, the greatest actors. And I think
it's all in the casting. I think he's a great caster of actors, and I think if you cast the right actor and they're any good, you barely have to do anything after that. I guess I interviewed Judy Davis once, and I asked about working with Cronenberg on Naked Lunch, and she said, well, he just creates this ambience, he creates this atmosphere, and you know what to do from that. And he sort of said the same thing in an interview I came across.
There's an amazing extra on the Cosmopolis Blu-ray, which is quite long, and you see him directing scene after scene, and the whole process is laid out. He lays it out, other people lay it out, and a lot of it has to do with that he doesn't rehearse the actors separate from the set, and how he brings in the actors and they walk through the possibilities of how the scene is going to be blocked. And then he goes away and he looks through now a remote at what the people are doing, and he only comes back when the actors come back prepared to do it, because he said, I have to be able to touch them, so I have to be there.
It's great.
His early films in Canada have not very distinguished acting.
No, not at all.
No,
And
that's
this is
true.
because he's got no money and no shooting schedule and no, not any kind of a group of experienced actors that he could use. So, and then as soon as he did get those resources, he did turn into this wonderful director of acting. Well, I mean, he probably directs those as most as wonderfully as he could under the terrible circumstances. But
yeah, once he sort of finds his feet with the Brood with acting, the next one is Scanners, and that was, I think, an instance where he very specifically cast Stephen Lack in the central role because it's something to do with his eyes. And Stephen Lack is totally wooden in that film, and he's the weakness in the film as a whole.
One thing that I find somewhat interesting is when actors, there seems to be some kind of convergence of like acting technique and the actual material of the stories. We talked a lot about transformation, and I feel like whenever an actor in one of his films is able to really dive into that idea, it can be very liberating, it seems. And I mean, Viggo Mortensen in A History of Violence, I mean, just the different bodily language he has when he's going back and forth between his presence, the kind of put on role that he has, and his past self. He just does these like muscle shifts, and he looks like a different person just by shifting his muscle posture and all of this. And I think a lot of the movies, and then Jeff Goldblum, I mean, when they're able to really like throw themselves into it, there's almost something about the outlandishness of the material that opens something up in the acting technique a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, he does create a mood. And I mean, Crash is a great example of that actors as different as James Spader and Holly Hunter like work so well together, and they all like convey this, make it emotionally realistic that they have this obsession with car crashes.
Well, there's the physicality of it, thinking of your body as this thing that you would, I think it just makes people rethink how they would position themselves and move themselves around. And that's something I just feel in his actors in his movies.
Yeah.
We've neglected Eastern Promises, which when I first saw it, I kind of dismissed as a romance. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, this is right on the moment. And I am so sorry there isn't an Eastern Promises 2. But Viggo is extraordinary in Eastern Promises. And when they were shooting it in London, that's when the first poisoning happened. And there, this guy was in the hospital right next to where their hotel was and had been poisoned by Putin. So Eastern Promises really was onto something. I just thought, well, I loved it. I mean, it was a great romance.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that I thought he really allowed himself simply to make a really romantic movie.
The Fly.
Yeah, I think The Fly is very romantic.
Yeah, okay.
And Butterfly was a romance, I guess.
And which one, sorry?
And Butterfly.
And Butterfly.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I guess there was an idea to do Eastern Promises too. I myself thought it would be you could have a whole series actually. Now that Viggo Mortensen is an agent completely in place and so on, you could
What he said was he would have wanted to shoot in Russia, and that Focus wouldn't give him the money to shoot in Russia, and that's when the project died.
Right. But he is going to do a film. They are going to work together again, supposedly. Cronenberg and Viggo Mortensen. That's supposed to be the next Cronenberg film.
There's going to be a next one? I thought he'd
Well, not Eastern. Oh,
not Eastern Promises.
Well, Viggo Mortensen said recently in an interview that they're about to do a film together, and that it's going to be in the vein of his horror movies. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Can I ask you guys what you think we will look, in 50 years, 100 years, how people will look at Cronenberg movies? I mean, will people look at the body horror the way we regard James Whale movies? With some filmmakers, you can project ahead and understand, but I can't do that with Cronenberg. Maybe it's because of the variety of his work.
I think Videodrome will always live in a way, and that it will not, because unlike some of the earlier stuff, it cannot simply be dismissed as James Whale through incorrect thinking. So I think that would be, of all those early films, I think that's the one that would survive as a real watershed film, as a real kind of moment in film history and horror film history too.
Yeah.
I think as time goes by, that his oeuvre will be sort of extrapolated from horror, really, to be considered more of a broad compendium of films about a kind of this late 20th century, early 20th century, 21st century dystopia. I mean, I think he's a great social critic, and that to me is how he uses genre, and if you step back from the visceral quality of the films, you see a great commentator on the mess we've made and the chaos caused by technology.
Yeah, I agree. I think technology is really his key theme, and the way that technology, that man is, humankind is being reshaped by the relationship between people and technology, and that will be it's a great question, Carrie.
Well, I think of him as a filmmaker as I think of Donna Haraway. Do you know her work? She writes about the cyber person, how people fuse with their computers and become androids. And I think it's not just technological, it's the way it's an evolutionary, it's evolution and adaptation. How pharmaceuticals, machinery, the teleport machine, the teleport machine and the fly, all these things are affecting us, and that's really interesting. No one else is making movies about.
Yeah, and I really feel like there's a coherent project there that he makes his films will sort of be of a piece. He's not a director who does takes on sort of genre projects the way, like, I don't know, maybe Soderbergh, I shouldn't name him, but there's a real coherence between all these different periods that we've been touching on.
Well, God's gift to auteurs. I'll just say that.
I have to say, I would be really interested to see him just take on a purely commercial kind of thriller and see what he did with it without any of the baggage that he brings to films. But I don't
History of Violence is that, surely.
Hmm?
Don't you think History of Violence is that?
No, not at all. I do think Eastern Promises comes closer.
Yeah.
But Gavin wrote something really interesting at the beginning of his introduction for Crash, in which didn't you say that what is at the core of Cronenberg is the problem of symbiosis? So whether we're talking about symbiosis with technology or with another human being, that does seem to me to be the central thing. And that's probably something that's not going to go away in 20 years or 50 years, and would be a way that people would come at these films. I mean, personally, I don't believe that in 25 years anyone's going to look at movies, but that could just be my pessimism.
And
They still read books, Amy.
They will read books, but movies are
I-
something else.
yeah, and I do recommend people buy Cronenberg's book, his novel Consumed, which you
Oh, it's
mentioned.
great.
David. Yeah,
It's great.
yeah.
And funny.
Yeah.
Oh, so funny.
There you go.
Yeah. There's one other quick footnote on the technology thing. I mean, I think a huge thing he's done there with technology is introduced carnality into it in a way that still really doesn't happen. And we even seem to get further away from what's going to happen in that kind of collision between bodies and technology. And he's consistently done that. And I kind of remember Existence kind of being laughed off by a lot of people or kind of ignored. But it's right there. I mean, in 10 years, we're going to be wondering what to do with the ports.
Yes.
Look
So I'm
who's
just going to come
come
back in the room to thank everybody for coming and participating in this. It's been an amazing conversation, and missed this type of engaged rapport about a director like this. This is not something I've gotten a chance to see or experience for a long time. So I really appreciate all of you being here for this. And thank you, David, for organizing.
Thank you. I think we hit every film except for Fast Company. So, so next time.
I've put into the chat links for 3 different places where you can access the book, which is on sale.
Thanks for that plug.
So please.
And also on YouTube, you can go watch the Last Jew at the Last Cinema in the World that Amy talked about. It's hilarious. It's very funny 4-minute piece. But
This is the first panel discussion I've ever enjoyed.
We have to end right there. Thank you, Carrie. Right. And thanks to all of you. I really enjoyed it too.
Thank you, David and Eric.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the book.
Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us if you tuned in. Thanks.